The splintering crash of wood ripped through Dorothy's sleep, freezing her blood. A guttural growl, too close, too wild, vibrated through the floorboards. She sat bolt upright, heart pounding, knowing a bear was tearing at her kitchen door. Before fear could fully grip her, a shaggy, arthritic form, barely visible in the dark, moved. Old Gus, deaf and aching, limped, putting his ancient body between her bedroom and the terrifying assault. A low, fierce rumble started deep in his chest. Before I continue, drop a comment telling me where you're listening to this from, and if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. You won't want to miss the ending. The sun was barely warming the frost off Harold's front porch when Dorothy McAllister arrived, her old truck kicking up dust on the gravel drive. She gripped her worn purse, her knuckles white before stepping out. Harold met her at the door, a tight smile on his face, followed by Walter, lanky and fidgety. Gus wasn't visible yet, but Dorothy could feel his presence, a heavy shadow in the air. "Morning, Mom," Harold said, his voice trying to be gentle, but it had a hard edge. "Come on in. Walter's got some coffee on." Inside, the kitchen was too clean, too quiet. Gus wasn't there. Dorothy sat at the kitchen table, refusing the coffee, her gaze sweeping the room. Her son and grandson avoided her eyes. "So, Mom," Harold began, leaning against the counter, arms crossed. "About Gus. We've been talking to the vet again, Dr. Jenkins. He agrees with us." Dorothy said nothing, just waited. She knew what was coming. She'd seen the way Gus had been looking lately. His eyes cloudy, his once magnificent shaggy coat dull and matted, despite her best efforts on her visits. He walked with a pronounced wobble, his hind legs stiff as old oak. "He can barely walk, Mom," Harold continued, his voice picking up a frustrated tone. "He's deaf as a post, doesn't even respond when you call him, just costing us money in food and vet bills, and for what? He can't even stand guard anymore. He's a shadow of what he used to be." Walter, emboldened by his father, chimed in. "He just lays around, Grandma. He's a trip hazard more than anything. We almost fell over him twice last week. It's time, Grandma. He's suffering. Dr. Jenkins said it's a kindness." Kindness. The word hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Dorothy remembered Gus as a puppy, all fluff and boundless energy, chasing her children across these very fields. She remembered him, strong and tireless, herding their small flock of sheep, barking a warning at a coyote or a stray dog. He'd been a fierce, loyal guardian, a constant companion to her grandchildren when they were small. He'd never once failed them. Now, in his twilight, they saw only burden. She looked at her son, then at her grandson, their faces set in what they believed was practical concern. They saw an expense, an inconvenience. They didn't see the flicker of spirit in his old eyes, the quiet dignity that still clung to him despite the pain. They couldn't remember the way his huge, shaggy head would press into her hand, a silent promise of devotion. "Where is he?" Dorothy asked, her voice low, cutting through their arguments. Harold hesitated. "Out back, in the kennel. We figured it would be easier if he wasn't underfoot." Dorothy pushed herself up from the table. "I want to see him." Harold sighed, exchanged a glance with Walter, then led her out to a small wire mesh kennel behind the barn. Gus was curled in a tight ball, his back to the world, a shaggy lump of sadness. His coat was rough, neglected, a far cry from the pristine white and gray he once was. Dorothy knelt, ignoring the damp ground. She reached through the wire, slowly, gently, and touched his matted fur. Gus didn't stir at first. She pressed her fingers firmly against his side, letting him feel the vibration. His head slowly lifted, his cloudy eyes blinking open, then widening as he finally registered her presence. A low, soft whine, barely audible, escaped him. He pushed his head into her hand, a lifetime of comfort in that small gesture. "He's not suffering in the way you think," Dorothy said, turning back to Harold and Walter, her voice steady. "He's just old, and he's family." She looked at Gus, then back at her son. "I'm taking him home." Harold's jaw dropped. "Mom, you can't. He's a burden. He needs constant care, and you're almost 80. What if he falls?" "Then I'll pick him up," Dorothy stated, her resolve like the ancient Ozark rocks around them. "He's coming with me." There was no arguing with her once her mind was made up. Harold and Walter exchanged frustrated glances, but they knew that look. Within the hour, Gus was being coaxed into the back seat of Dorothy's old truck, his arthritic legs struggling with the step up. Dorothy settled him onto a worn blanket, his heavy head resting on her thigh as she pulled away from Harold's farm. The familiar winding roads of the Ozarks passed by, trees blurring into green and brown streaks. Gus's breathing was deep and slow against her leg, a comforting weight. He was exhausted, yes, but he was with her. She stroked his shaggy head, feeling the warmth of his old body, the steady thump of his heart. She knew he was deaf to the hum of the engine, the rustle of the wind, even her soft words. But he felt the gentle rhythm of her fingers, the vibration of her love, and for Dorothy that was more than enough. He was home. He was safe. Dorothy's little farmhouse sat nestled among ancient oaks and hickories, miles from the paved road, a beacon of quiet solitude. When she pulled into her drive, the gravel crunching under the tires was the loudest sound for miles around. Gus whined softly, a low rumble in his chest, as she opened the truck door. He braced his stiff legs, hesitating, then carefully stepped down, his tail giving a slow, tentative wag. The neglected fur around his eyes seemed to lift, as if he recognized the scent of home, a place of peace. The small porch was a familiar sight, worn wood boards and a swing that creaked gently in the breeze. Gus moved slowly through the door Dorothy held open, sniffing the worn linoleum, the faded rugs, the scent of lavender and old wood that was Dorothy's home. He hobbled straight to the rag rug by the old wood stove, circled twice with effort, and collapsed with a soft grunt, settling into a deep, immediate sleep. This was his spot, a place he knew from years ago, and his body remembered its comfort. Life settled into a gentle rhythm at the farmhouse. Every morning Dorothy would wake before the sun, but she always waited for Gus. He'd be stiff, his hind legs protesting the cold morning air. She'd kneel beside him, her hands gnarled with age but still strong, working gently into the thick fur of his lower back and legs. She felt the knotty joints, the tremors of pain, and rubbed warmth into his old muscles. He'd sigh, a deep, contented sound, pushing his shaggy head into her palm. Only after these morning massages would he attempt to rise, groaning softly as he pushed himself up. Their daily ritual continued with a slow, meandering walk to the mailbox down the dirt road. It was hardly a brisk stroll. Gus moved at a lumbering shuffle, stopping often to sniff a particularly interesting patch of weeds, or to simply rest, his heavy breathing a puff of steam in the cool air. Dorothy never hurried him. She'd simply stand by, leaning on her cane, enjoying the quiet woods. When they returned, a piece of buttered toast, crumbled into his bowl, was Gus's reward. He'd eat it slowly, deliberately, his old teeth working through the soft bread. Gus became Dorothy's constant, silent shadow. If she went out to tend her small vegetable garden, Gus would slowly follow, finding a sunny spot near the tomatoes, collapsing with a thud and watching her with half-closed eyes. He rarely barked, his voice largely unused, but if a squirrel chattered too loudly or a deer ventured too close to the fence line, a low, rumbling growl would vibrate in his chest, a deep, primal warning that reminded Dorothy of the magnificent dog he once was. In the afternoons, Dorothy would settle on the porch swing, peeling apples for a pie, humming old hymns. Gus would lay by her feet, his head resting on her worn work boots, his presence a warm weight. She talked to him constantly, not shouting, but in soft, familiar tones, narrating her day, telling him about the birds, the weather, the plans for supper. She knew he couldn't hear the words, but she felt him respond to the vibration of her voice, the gentle cadence. Sometimes she'd gently tap his side, and he would always lift his head, bumping it against her hand, a silent acknowledgement, a deeply ingrained connection. Evenings were the quietest, most comforting time. Gus would be stretched out by her rocking chair, his heavy breathing a steady, rhythmic sigh, as Dorothy knitted or read. His deafness meant no jarring noises disturbed his sleep, and his arthritis meant no restless pacing. He was simply there, a warm, shaggy presence, a veteran of years, deserving of every moment of rest and peace. Dorothy, watching him, felt a profound gratitude. Her son and grandson had seen a burden. She saw a gift. The farmhouse settled into a comfortable quiet, a gentle hum of two old souls finding their rhythm. Gus, initially exhausted, slowly regained a measure of his strength, enough to navigate the few rooms and the yard. Every morning Dorothy still knelt, her hands finding the stiff knots in his hind legs, working warmth into his muscles. Gus would lean into her touch, a deep, rumbling sigh vibrating through his shaggy chest. She'd feel the subtle tremors of pain, but also the deep, trusting relaxation that followed her touch. Only then, with a soft groan, would he push himself up, ready for their slow journey to the old mailbox down the dusty lane. Their walks were never rushed. Dorothy would lean on her cane, keeping pace with Gus's lumbering shuffle. Sometimes a deer would rustle in the undergrowth, or a hawk would circle overhead. Gus, deaf to the sounds, would still tilt his head, his nose twitching, catching the scent of the wild world. Dorothy would point things out, speaking in her soft, calm voice. "Look, Gus, there's old Mr. Finch," she'd say, indicating a cardinal perched on a branch, knowing he wouldn't hear, but wanting to share the simple beauty of their mornings. He'd always respond by bumping his head gently against her leg, a silent acknowledgement of her presence, her words. Back at the house, a ritual commenced. Dorothy would sit at her kitchen table, a piece of toast, warm and buttered, cooling on her plate. Gus would settle patiently beside her, his head low. She'd tear off a small piece, crumbling it into his bowl, and he would eat it with slow, deliberate pleasure, his old teeth working carefully. It was a simple offering, a daily sacrament of their quiet understanding. Gus became Dorothy's shadow, but a soft, unhurried one. If she moved towards the kitchen, he would slowly follow, his heavy steps deliberate, until he found a patch of sun by the back door to lie down. If she went out to her small garden, he would find a cool spot under the oak tree, watching her with half-closed eyes, a shaggy, vigilant presence. He never got underfoot, always moving with an intuitive grace that belied his age and infirmities, somehow knowing where she was without needing to hear her footsteps. One afternoon, a late spring storm rolled in, darkening the sky with bruised purple clouds. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low growl that made the glass panes in the old window rattle. Dorothy sat in her rocking chair by the wood stove, knitting a blanket, the needles clicking softly. Gus lay stretched out on the rag rug, his head on his paws, seemingly oblivious to the approaching storm's fury. Dorothy reached out, her hand resting on his massive, shaggy flank. His fur was surprisingly soft beneath her fingers, despite its neglected appearance from before. She felt the steady, slow beat of his old heart. "You know, old boy," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper against the rising wind. "They said you were useless, a burden, said you were too old for anything but a final sleep." She stroked his fur, her thumb moving in slow circles. "But they don't know, do they? They don't know what it feels like to have you here, a warm presence, a loyal friend?" Gus stirred, not rising, but turning his head slightly, his cloudy eyes fixing on her face. He didn't hear the words she knew, but he felt the vibration of her hand, the quiet emotion in her voice. He nudged his head into her leg, a soft, familiar gesture that spoke volumes. "You're more than just an old dog, Gus," she continued, a small smile touching her lips. "You're family, and family takes care of its own. Always." She leaned down, pressing her cheek against his shaggy head, feeling the warmth of his fur, the comforting weight of his presence. Outside, the first fat drops of rain began to fall, pattering softly on the tin roof. But inside, in their little farmhouse, there was only peace, a profound and quiet understanding forged in the silence between them. The quiet understanding in Dorothy's farmhouse settled into the deep, still hours of the night. The rain had long since stopped, leaving the Ozark woods hushed and dripping in a way that amplified every tiny creak of the old house. Dorothy was deep in sleep, nestled beneath her worn patchwork quilt, her breathing soft and even. Gus, a shaggy, familiar presence, was curled on his rug beside her bed, lost to the heavy slumber of an old dog. The air in the small room grew steadily colder as the last embers in the wood stove faded to ash. Outside, the winter had been long and hard. Food was scarce, and a heavy-footed black bear, lean and desperate, roamed closer to human dwellings than it ever dared in better times. It had caught the tantalizing scent of something warm, something sweet, drifting on the cold night air. The ghost of freshly baked bread, perhaps, or the rich aroma of Dorothy's stored preserves. A primal hunger gnawed at its belly, pushing it closer past the boundary it usually respected. The first sound wasn't loud, not enough to wake Dorothy. It was a soft scrape, like a branch brushing against the back porch, then a low, inquisitive snuffling against the flimsy screen door of the kitchen. Gus, despite his profound deafness, stirred. An ancient alarm, deeper than sound, had tripped within his old bones. He lifted his head, his cloudy eyes opening in the pitch-dark room. A low, barely audible rumble, a tremor more than a growl, vibrated in his chest. His nose twitched, picking up the unmistakable scent of wildness, of raw, untamed power. Another scrape, louder this time, followed by a distinct thud against the wooden back door. The screen door gave a soft tear. Gus, still a dark shape on the floor, began to push himself up, a slow, agonizing effort for his arthritic hind legs. He was stiff, every joint aching, but something else, something far more powerful than pain, was waking inside him. The deep, protective instinct that had made him a magnificent guardian in his prime was flickering back to life. Dorothy stirred then, a frown creasing her brow, but didn't quite wake. The bear, growing bolder, began to claw at the wood frame around the screen door, testing its strength. Rip. A splintering sound, sharp and violent, sliced through the quiet night. Then a deep, guttural growl, too close, too wild, reverberated through the very timbers of the house. Dorothy bolted upright, her heart leaping into her throat. Her breath hitched. What was that? Her mind, still groggy with sleep, struggled to make sense of the horrifying noise. It wasn't a dream. It was real. The distinct smell of something musky and raw now permeated the kitchen, drifting into her bedroom. Another violent crack. The sound of wood splintering, protesting under immense force, was terrifyingly close. It was coming from the kitchen, from her back door. A low, snuffling sound, then another deep growl, a rumble that seemed to shake the floorboards beneath her bare feet. And since you've made it this far, go ahead and hit that like button. It really helps me keep bringing stories like this. Dorothy fumbled for the lamp on her bedside table, her hands shaking so badly she almost knocked it over. Light flooded the small room, but it did little to chase away the icy grip of fear. She strained her ears, listening, dread building in her chest. The scratching, tearing sounds were relentless now, punctuated by the heavy breathing of a large animal, right on the other side of her thin wooden door. She was alone, utterly, terribly alone, facing an impossible terror. Before she could even swing her legs out of bed, before she could utter a single frightened sound, Gus was already up. His old arthritic body moved with a purpose she hadn't seen in years. He wasn't running, not even fast, but he was moving, a low guttural growl, raspy from disuse, rumbling deep in his chest. He was heading for the kitchen doorway, a shaggy, determined shadow, placing his ancient, aching body directly between Dorothy's bedroom and the savage assault on her home. Gus, a shaggy, determined shadow, pushed his old body forward, his arthritic legs protesting every agonizing step. He wasn't fast, but his intention was clear. He moved directly into the narrow kitchen doorway, bracing his stiff frame, creating a living barrier between Dorothy's terror-stricken bedroom and the violent assault on her home. The low growl that had rumbled in his chest now rose, hoarse and raspy, escalating into a series of powerful guttural barks, sounds that had been dormant for years but now vibrated with an ancient primal ferocity. Dorothy, frozen in her bed, watched in horrified disbelief. The lamp cast long dancing shadows as Gus, despite his painful joints, launched himself forward, not away but into the fray. He crashed against the flimsy wooden door with surprising force, his heavy body shaking the very frame. On the other side, the tearing sounds paused for a heartbeat, a surprised huff from the unseen beast. Then the attack renewed with furious energy. Claws ripped savagely at the thin wood, splinters flying inward, one piece narrowly missing Gus's snout. A section of the doorframe groaned, then began to give way, exposing a jagged gap. The musky smell grew stronger, filling the small farmhouse. Gus, a wall of shaggy fur and unwavering loyalty, threw his weight against the weakening door. He snarled, a sound more dog than she had heard in years, and snapped his old teeth through the splintered wood where the bear's claws were tearing. He wasn't just barking, he was actively engaging, attempting to deter the intruder, to physically prevent the door from bursting inwards. A massive, dark paw, tipped with terrifying claws, thrust through the newly created gap, aiming for the door's latch. Gus, without hesitation, lunged, his jaws closing around the rough fur and bone of the bear's paw. A sharp yelp of pain erupted from outside, followed by an enraged roar. The bear, startled by the old dog's unexpected fierce retaliation, lashed back with brutal speed. A sharp claw raked across Gus's side, tearing through his matted fur with a sickening rip. A deep, gash appeared, staining the white and gray fur instantly red. Gus staggered, a whine escaping him, but he held his ground. Before he could fully recover, another swipe, swift and merciless, caught his ear. Blood welled instantly, dripping down his shaggy neck, matting the fur around his jaw. He shook his head, disoriented for a moment, but still he didn't retreat. His barks, though growing weaker, became more desperate, fueled by pure, stubborn courage. His body was a bleeding, defiant wall of shaggy fur and old courage, aching and broken but utterly dedicated. He wouldn't let it pass, not as long as he had breath left to snarl. Gus, despite the deep gash on his flank that now oozed dark blood into his shaggy coat, and the steadily dripping wound on his ear, refused to yield. His old body was a shield, blocking the widening gap in the door, absorbing the desperate blows of the frustrated bear. The bear's guttural roars filled the small kitchen, a sound of fury and hunger. But Gus met each one with a hoarse, rattling bark, his voice raw from the exertion. He stumbled, his arthritic legs threatening to give out, yet he always found the strength to right himself, to stand firm, a testament to a forgotten strength. His once powerful charges were now merely desperate shoves against the splintering wood, but they were enough. They bought precious seconds. Dorothy, still trembling in her bed, watched the horrifying ballet of loyalty and brute force. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. Gus, her old deaf Gus, was fighting for her, a living, bleeding wall. Shame mixed with an impossible, surging pride. How could anyone have called him useless? Her gaze darted around the dim room, searching for something, anything. Her hand, shaking, reached for the bedside table, fingers fumbling over old trinkets until they closed around a metal cylinder. The air horn, a silly thing she'd bought years ago for the occasional rowdy coyote, never imagining she'd use it against something this monstrous. It felt flimsy in her trembling grip, but it was all she had. With a surge of desperate resolve, Dorothy pressed the button. A piercing, unearthly wail tore through the night, a sound so sudden and shrill it seemed to shred the silence. The bear, already frustrated by the old dog's unyielding defense, flinched violently. Its roars choked off. The scratching stopped. The air horn wailed again, long and agonizing, a sound alien to the quiet Ozark woods. There was a final, frustrated huff from the other side of the splintered door. Dorothy heard heavy shuffling, the sound of thick fur scraping against the porch planks, then the crashing of undergrowth as the bear, its hunger momentarily forgotten in the face of such a cacophony, and the old dog's fierce tenacity, lumbered away into the inky blackness. The monstrous threat receded, fading into the wild from which it came, leaving behind only the acrid smell of wild animal and the devastating silence. The sudden quiet was almost as terrifying as the assault itself. Dorothy dropped the air horn, her hands still shaking. She stared at the kitchen doorway where Gus stood, a terrible silhouette in the faint light. He was swaying, his once broad shoulders slumped, his breaths coming in ragged, painful gasps. The white fur on his side was matted with crimson, and his ear hung at an odd, bloody angle. He had held the line. He had won. Then, with a soft whimper that Dorothy felt rather than heard, Gus's legs finally gave way. He collapsed, a heavy, shaggy heap of exhaustion and pain, right there in the kitchen doorway. His eyes, usually cloudy and distant, were fixed on her, a profound, unwavering loyalty shining through the pain. Dorothy didn't hesitate. She scrambled out of bed, her own aches forgotten, and stumbled towards him. She knelt beside him on the cold kitchen floor, her hands, gnarled with age but still strong, cradling his massive head. Tears, hot and uncontrollable, streamed down her face, splashing onto his matted fur. "Oh, Gus," she choked out, her voice broken. "My brave, sweet boy." She stroked his bloody fur gently, afraid to hurt him further. He was panting, utterly spent. But he met her gaze, a deep, silent understanding passing between them. With an immense effort that spoke of a will stronger than his body, Gus shifted. He pushed himself onto his front paws, then slowly, agonizingly, dragged his injured hindquarters back towards her bedroom, inch by painful inch. He moved until he was once again at the foot of her bed, by the spot where he always slept. With a final, shuddering sigh, the old dog lowered his head to his paws, settling back into his familiar position, a broken but ever-present guardian, just as he always had. The first weak light of dawn barely touched the kitchen, painting the splintered wood and scattered debris in muted grays. Dorothy had done what she could for Gus. She'd cleaned the wound on his flank with warm water and an old clean cloth, then wrapped it clumsily with strips torn from a bedsheet. The torn ear was still bleeding faintly, but the worst seemed over. Gus lay by her bed, breathing shallowly, his eyes half closed. He was still, utterly spent, but alive. A deep gratitude settled over Dorothy, heavy and profound, pushing through her exhaustion. She didn't sleep again, just sat in her rocking chair, watching the rise and fall of Gus's shaggy side. The sun was a pale disk above the Ozark tree line when the telephone, Dorothy's old landline, jangled abruptly on the kitchen wall. She jumped, her nerves still frayed. Her neighbor, Maybelle, had called, worried by the sound of Dorothy's air horn wailing in the night. Dorothy explained, her voice trembling but resolute, and Maybelle, always practical, insisted on calling Harold. It wasn't long after, maybe an hour or so, that the familiar rumble of Harold's old pickup truck echoed up the long gravel drive. Dorothy heard it approach, then the squeak of brakes, followed by the crunch of heavy boots on the porch. A moment later, a sharp rap on her front door. Dorothy rose slowly, her body stiff and aching from the night's ordeal. She opened the door to find Harold and Walter standing on her porch. Harold's face, usually set in a determined frown, was pale and etched with something akin to dread. Walter, lanky and usually quick with a sarcastic remark, stood awkwardly behind his father, his eyes wide. They clearly expected to find her in distress, perhaps even injured. "Mom, what in the world happened?" Maybelle called, said she heard the horn that something was attacking. Harold's voice was rough with concern, his gaze sweeping over Dorothy, searching for injuries. Dorothy just nodded, unable to find the words right away. She stepped aside, letting them into the small living room, the quiet tension in the air almost palpable. Then she turned and pointed, not to herself, but towards the kitchen. Harold's eyes followed her gesture. He walked slowly, hesitantly towards the kitchen doorway, Walter trailing a few steps behind him. The sight that met their eyes silenced them completely. The back door, usually a solid barrier, was a mess of splintered wood, hanging precariously on one hinge. The screen door was ripped to shreds, hanging in tatters. Claw marks, deep and savage, gouged into the frame and the door itself. A fresh, pungent smell, unmistakably wild, still clung to the air. Harold inhaled sharply, his face losing even more color. He stepped closer, reaching out to touch a jagged splinter, then pulled his hand back as if burned. Walter peered over his father's shoulder, his jaw slack. He looked from the destroyed door to the small puddle of dried blood on the floor where Gus had first collapsed. Dorothy, her arms wrapped around herself, walked into the bedroom. Gus lay quietly on his rug, the sheet bandage a stark white against his dark fur. His eyes were open now, tracking her movements, but his head was heavy on his paws. Harold and Walter slowly followed her, their steps hushed. They saw Gus then, weak and bandaged, his shaggy coat still matted with drying blood, his ear swollen and dark. Harold cleared his throat, a dry, raspy sound. He looked at Gus, then at Dorothy, then back at the door, the truth of the night's events an undeniable, brutal reality. The words he usually spoke about Gus being a useless burden, an expensive liability, died unspoken in his throat. He saw the gaping claw marks on Gus's side, the torn ear, the exhaustion etched on Dorothy's face. He saw the shattered kitchen door, a testament to a defense he had always declared impossible for an old dog. Walter, usually so quick to dismiss Gus as a trip hazard, simply stared. He knelt slowly, almost reverently beside Gus, his hand hovering uncertainly over the dog's head. The arguments, the practicalities, the scoffing about Dorothy's foolish kindness, they were all swallowed whole by the overwhelming evidence of Gus's impossible life-saving courage. They stood in silence, not scoffers anymore, but witnesses to the undeniable power of loyalty and love, a power they had gravely underestimated. Harold's throat worked, a visible lump moving as he tried to swallow. The air in the small bedroom was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of shattered assumptions. He looked from his son, still kneeling by the injured dog, to his mother, who stood, her own exhaustion evident, yet with a fierce, quiet dignity. He had called Gus a burden, a drain, an animal no longer worth saving. Yet here was the proof, undeniable and stark, that Gus had saved. The silence eventually broke, not with an apology, but with a practical, almost gruff offer from Harold. He drove Dorothy and Gus to the nearest small-town vet, miles away, the bumpy ride a slow agony for the injured Old English Sheepdog. The vet, a kind woman who knew Dorothy well, treated Gus's deep claw mark with stitches and strong antibiotics, cleaned his torn ear, and marveled at the old dog's resilience. She confirmed what Dorothy already knew. Gus was a fighter. The days that followed were a quiet testament to a profound shift. Harold and Walter didn't just disappear. They returned, not with arguments, but with offerings. Harold brought lumber and tools, painstakingly repairing the shredded kitchen door, reinforcing it with extra bolts and stronger wood. He worked silently, the rhythmic clang of his hammer against nails a steady beat in the afternoon air. Walter, for his part, helped Dorothy gently walk Gus out to do his business, supporting his old frame as Gus wobbled on his healing legs. He'd fetch fresh water, even sit for long stretches on the porch with Gus, gently scratching behind the dog's good ear, the one that wasn't bandaged. Gus's recovery was slow, marked by small daily victories. The stiffness in his hind legs, always present, seemed even more pronounced for a time, but his spirit, never truly broken, began to return. His appetite picked up. He'd nudge his head against Dorothy's hand more frequently, a silent request for a comforting stroke. The deep gash on his flank slowly knitted together, leaving a faint scar hidden beneath his growing fur. The torn ear would always carry its story, a badge of his bravery. Weeks turned into a month. The Ozark spring deepened, painting the hillsides in vibrant greens. One evening, as the sun dipped below the distant ridge, casting long shadows across Dorothy's porch, Harold sat quietly beside Gus. The old dog was curled on his favorite rug, his breathing soft and even. Harold wasn't doing anything specific, just being there. He had stopped by, as he had many evenings lately, to check on his mother and, surprisingly, on Gus. Dorothy emerged from the kitchen with 2 steaming mugs of herbal tea, handing one to Harold. She settled into her rocking chair, the familiar creak a comforting sound in the twilight. She watched her son, his shoulders less tense than they used to be, his gaze resting on the old, scarred dog. "He really is something, isn't he?" Dorothy said softly, her voice carrying no hint of triumph, just a quiet observation. Harold nodded, taking a slow sip of his tea. "Yeah, Mom, he really is." He paused, then cleared his throat again. I was wrong about him. We both were." The words were difficult, but they were true, hanging in the soft evening air. Dorothy simply smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. "Sometimes," she said, her voice filled with a lifetime of wisdom, "the ones we think are past their use, the ones we write off too soon, they're the very ones who still have the most to give. You just have to be willing to see it." Gus shifted slightly, letting out a soft, contented sigh in his sleep. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Your support is what brings these stories to more people.